This is Andrew Natsios. He was in charge of international aid under George W. Bush, and in 2001 he went before Congress to argue against using resources to fight the AIDS pandemic in Africa. You see, the Bush administration didn't want to pay, so they made the argument that even if we could flood Africa with AIDS medication, it wouldn't help. Why? Well, here's what he said. If you have traveled to rural Africa, you know this. This is not a criticism, just a different world. People do not know what watches and clocks are. They do not use Western means for telling time. They use the sun. These drugs have to be administered during a certain sequence of time during the day. And when you say take it at 10 o'clock, people will say, what do you mean by 10 o'clock? Yeah, he actually said this. That's right. They really said we can't fight AIDS because Africans can't tell time. Now, besides being a wild generalization of a continent with 54 different countries, this wasn't even true. As health experts told the Boston Globe, most regimens by 2001 required just 1 to 2 pills daily, not some strict time schedule. Plus, you could, give them watches. How much does a watch even cost? At $2? Today, we expect some amount of completely unhinged takes in American politics. But this African watch comment was back in 2001, way before the internet destroyed everything. Where did they get this absolutely batshit idea? Well, maybe, just maybe, they got it from this episode of The West Wing that aired on October 25th, 2000.
If tomorrow we made AIDS medication free to every patient in your country, as much as they needed for as long as they needed it, it would likely make very little difference.
What's the problem? They don't own wristwatches. They can't tell time.
Well, that's eerily similar, isn't it? While the West Wing built a reputation of being a kind of hopeful, parallel liberal reality to the conservative nightmare that was George W. Bush, it could, as this wristwatch story makes pretty clear, end up providing cover and talking points for that same administration. And that really shifted into high gear after this little thing called 9/11. Maybe you've heard of it. The attacks on September 11th kicked off the War on Terror, which is probably the number one thing George W. Bush is remembered for. It was like his whole thing, that or golf.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Today, I think there are a lot of people who understand the War on Terror to have been a colossally bad idea, having caused literal decades of war with little to nothing to show for it. According to the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, the US post-9/11 military interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia have directly caused the deaths of at least 400,000 civilians. And if we zoom out, indirect deaths from famine and decimated infrastructure bring the death toll to over 4.5 million. Yeah, I understand why that guy threw his shoe. And that's to say nothing of the nearly 20,000 Allied soldiers that the US sent to their deaths.
They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.
When I was a teenager, Bush was the president, and I fucking hated Bush.
Hey, why would you ever invest that in anybody else?
Because they killed 1 million people.
But while Bush gets a lot of blame for the War on Terror, and make no mistake, that's not paint on his fingers, it's blood, the reality is that the War on Terror never hits its level of death and destruction without some Democratic Party buy-in, without a bipartisan coalition of liberals willing to go along with it. Of our 535 members of Congress, only one person voted against the authorization of military force following the September 11th attacks, which was an open-ended mandate that is actually still in effect today.
Our country is in a state of mourning. Some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause just for a minute and think through the implications of our actions today.
That's Barbara Lee, progressive icon and apparent prophet, because she was absolutely right to be concerned about that being the beginning of a never-ending crusade. Just 1 year later, in October 2002, despite absolutely no evidence tying Saddam Hussein to 9/11 and UN inspections finding no weapons of mass destruction in his country, Congress voted to authorize military force in Iraq, with 58% of Senate Democrats and 39.2% of House Democrats voting for it. And this full-throated endorsement of war wasn't just coming from establishment Democrats. At the 2003 Oscars, which took place just 4 days after the beginning of the invasion of Iraq, filmmaker Michael Moore was joined by all of the other nominees for Best Documentary to speak out against the war. And they were overwhelmingly booed by liberal Hollywood.
We We live in a time where we have a man sending us to war for fictitious reasons, whether it's the fictition of duct tape or the fictitious of orange alerts. We are against this war, Mr. Bush. Shame on you, Mr. Bush. Shame on you. And anytime you've got the Pope and the Dixie Chicks against you, your time is up.
Ugh, those were the good old days before Hollywood got all woke. You know, nowadays, they just fire people for supporting Palestine, send letters to Joe Biden with the false allegation that babies were beheaded on October 7th, and stay weirdly silent when Israeli officials kidnap a filmmaker days after the Academy itself gave him an Oscar. So woke! But how did this happen? How were liberals duped by one of the most bloodthirsty regimes in all of American history? Well, maybe. Just maybe. It's because a lot of liberals and conservatives were making pretty similar arguments in favor of the war, which brings us back to the West Wing, which also experienced a paradigm shift after 9/11. Here's how TV critic and writer Emily St. James laid it out for me in our conversation.
The second era is seasons 3 and 4, which is after September 11th, and Aaron Sorkin's kind of losing the plot because suddenly reality is so different from his show. And he wants his show to reflect reality, but also he knows he can't just like have suddenly President Bartlett's fighting Al-Qaeda, because it's just like not the world we're in. So he comes up with kind of an analog for it that occasionally works, and there's good episodes in those seasons, but it's very much, you can tell he's straining to make his show match a reality instead of just being like, and we're going to keep doing a liberal Fantasia.
As Emily points out, The West Wing never did any kind of plotline directly concerning Iraq, but its multiple plotlines that featured the fictional countries of Kumar and Kundu can't be separated from the political conversations happening just a channel flip away. Here is a speech that The West Wing aired on January 16th, 2002, intercut with George W. Bush's State of the Union just 13 days later, where he famously named Iraq as part of the axis of evil.
The civilized world faces unprecedented dangers. Yet the state of our union has never been stronger.
Now, in a new century, when we meet and master new forms of aggression and hatred, ignorance and evil, our vigilance in the face of oppression and global terror will be unequaled by any moment in human history.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
And to the enemies of freedom, the enemies of democracy, the enemies of America, the enemies of humanity itself, we say here tonight with one voice, there is no corner of this earth so remote, no cave so dark, that you will not be found and brought to light and ended.
I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
While that West Wing episode was obviously written and filmed much earlier than January 2002, I think it's pretty telling that these speeches are virtually indistinguishable. The West Wing's third season, the one that aired right after 9/11 and into 2002, was its most watched, ranking as the 10th most watched show of that TV season. And considering its reputation, I think it's safe to say that a good chunk of those viewers thought of themselves as liberals. Just months before the UN Secretary General declared the invasion of Iraq to be illegal, the West Wing was promoting the idea that any UN criticism was just posturing, and that actually we're the real UN.
The UN doesn't want this. They want to wring their hands and censor us after, but they expect us to take care of things like this.
The show talked frequently about the inherent violence of Muslim people.
Trust the people, Jed. They'll make rational decisions.
In the deserts of Arabia, are there any rational decisions?
And just a month before the Bush administration invaded Iraq, the West Wing boldly proposed to its liberal audience that America should think of itself as...
like Mother Teresa with first strike capability.
Damn right.
Welcome to The Worst Wing, a mini-series of videos exploring the West Wing's influence on American politics, and especially the Democratic Party, who just can't seem to let the past die. The West Wing. It's my 9/11. Last episode, we talked about how the West Wing ruined the Democratic Party, and today we're going to talk about how the West Wing decimated multiple civilizations. This is Worst Wing 2, Dub Dose, and I'm about to go D-Day on Aaron Sorkin's ass. In episode 1, we kept it pretty broad, focusing mostly on the demeanor of the show and its king-like reverence for the presidency. The goal was to get people to look more critically at the show this time, and not just retreat into a fantasy world. I think in many ways, The West Wing has directly sold our current hellscape to us, not challenging power so much as finding better excuses for it. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the show's embrace of the War on Terror.
We need to find them and to kill them. We kill them. Then we find out who sent them and we kill them too.
Josh?
You kill the people who did it, you kill the people who planned it, then you kill everyone who was happy about it.
So today, in our second Worst Wing video, we're going to look at how the West Wing laundered the War on Terror to a liberal audience, and more specifically, the invasion of Iraq. Of course, Iraq was not the only theater of this war. As of today, there has been armed conflict in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, Pakistan, and even the freaking Philippines under the banner War on Terror. But I do think that the decision to invade Iraq is a kind of inflection point. What started out in Afghanistan as a mission to get Osama bin Laden was on the verge of spilling out into a larger regional conflict, and there was a lot of public debate, both leading up to the invasion and then to justify it in hindsight. Perhaps by understanding the West Wing's case for the War on Terror, we can more easily understand why it continued under subsequent liberal administrations. After all, Barack Obama never closed Guantanamo Bay. He expanded the United States drone assassination program and refused to hold any of the people behind our country's torture program accountable. 7 years later, Biden wholeheartedly supported the ethnic cleansing of a different Arab population, one that has continued and been escalated under Trump. Both Biden and Obama ended up embracing various parts of the War on Terror in a way that left the door open for further escalations of military violence and civil rights violations. The truth is, we don't get Trump deporting American citizens to El Salvadoran concentration camps without liberals buying into the War on Terror. And this is all in service of my larger goal, understanding the Democratic Party that has completely failed to even fight fascism, so that, maybe we could start putting up a fight and stop stepping on rakes like we're in the fucking Looney Tunes. Or, at least maybe we can stop watching The West Wing. For this video, I'm going to go through 4 different rationales for the invasion of Iraq and highlight how the West Wing portrayed those same arguments to its massive liberal audience in real time, and how those same arguments are still being used today.
You kill an American, any American, we don't come back with a proportional response. We come back with total disaster.
Oh yeah, I've got receipts. You can actually check out this entire timeline in the description of this video. It's interactive and everything. It took me forever. Please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. It's the only way I can go as in-depth on these videos as the subject matter demands. Patreon.com/skipintro. It is, how I pay the rent. Reason number 1, keeping our nation safe.
We agree that the Iraqi dictator must not be permitted to threaten America and the world with horrible poisons and diseases and gases and atomic weapons. Since we all agree on this goal, the issue is, how best can we achieve it?
The first and most prominent reason the Bush administration gave for the invasion of Iraq was that Iraqi president and frequent South Park punching bag Saddam Hussein
Who's my grandpa?
posed a threat to national security. Which I think, at the time, was a little like worrying you were going to lose a race to a guy whose legs you'd just cut off. Because just over a decade earlier, the United States had led a coalition force of 42 countries that beat the living shit out of the Iraqi military in Operation Desert Storm.
The coalition took only 100 hours to destroy the Iraqi forces in Kuwait.
After the war, the Iraqi military got even weaker. By 2002, the army had been reduced from over 1 million before the war to just 375,000. The popular army was completely disbanded, and the Air Force had less than 300 aircraft. But you see, the US wasn't worried about a conventional war. They were worried about the dreaded WMDs, which for you youngsters out there stands for Weapons of Mass Destruction and not WebMD, although WebMD has been kind of a WMD to the medical institution. While the international consensus was that Iraq was nowhere near capable of producing nuclear weapons, in 2002, then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice went on TV to raise the specter of a nuclear strike.
There will always be some uncertainty
about how quickly he can acquire a nuclear weapon. But we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
This was also a little ridiculous, as Jeremy Greenstock, British ambassador to the United Nations, and later the British special representative in Iraq, told Vanity Fair in a 2008 oral history of the Bush administration, of course there were worries that Iraq might try if the opportunity presented itself to reconstitute that capability. We were watching this the whole time. There was never any proof, never any hard intelligence that they had succeeded in doing that. And the American system was entirely aware of this.
Wait a minute, I know you've said this, but I mean, there was no question at the time of the American invasion, in your mind and in the British government's mind and in Tony Blair's mind, that they had no nuclear capability.
No question at all. We knew that.
Is that what Tony Blair says?
Yes.
Indeed, the UN restarted inspections of Iraq's military capabilities in November 2002 and found no evidence of WMD production. Although, it should be noted that they were forced to stop because the US invaded in March 2003. I mean, why bother looking for weapons of mass destruction when you can just put them there yourself by dropping them out of airplanes? Boom! Now, over on the West Wing, the show never really talked about this political issue directly. It only ever mentioned Iraq in passing. But instead of directly confronting the situation building in Iraq, the show opted to deal with the arguments made about the coming invasion through stand-ins. In May 2002, the West Wing aired an episode about how Iran was building up nuclear capabilities.
Mr. President, I am not your national security advisor or your Secretary of Defense or State, but the Russians are giving Iran the bomb.
Later that month, they used the fictional country of Kumar, located somewhere in southern Iran, to discuss issues of national security and state sponsors of terrorism. As it turns out, Kumar's Minister of Defense, a guy named Abdul Ibn Sharif, was actually a key leader of the Bahi Network, which was the West Wing's version of Al-Qaeda, and not some corporate division at Mountain Dew.
Are you telling me the Kumari defense minister may have ordered an attack on the Golden Gate Bridge?
The Bartlett administration thinks long and hard about what they want to do about it, ultimately settling on the reasonable and measured approach of covertly assassinating the Crown Prince. Now, how do Bartlett and the Bartlett boys know about Sharif's involvement? Well, that's easy. They got intelligence that Sharif had done it through the KGB, who had tortured it out of a Chechen prisoner.
His testimony was reached after prolonged physical abuse by Russian soldiers.
He was tortured?
Yes, sir.
Now, I think there's a lot going on here. First of all, the West Wing is making the argument that the US does not torture or make use of torture, which, of course, we know is bullshit. At the time, the US was using a systematic program of enhanced interrogation that included waterboarding, mock executions, and sensory deprivation, all things that were in violation of the Geneva Convention. Yeah, sure, we know that now, you might be saying. The West Wing didn't know that back then. Well, I guess that would be true, if the writers hadn't been paying attention. 4 months earlier, in January 2002, the first prisoners arrived at Guantanamo Bay, and it was covered by the mainstream press, who noted how the location was specifically chosen because it existed not on official US soil, and therefore was outside both US and international law. A month later in February, Bush signed an executive order denying Geneva protections to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And just days before this Sharif storyline started airing on the West Wing, the US officially withdrew from the International Criminal Court, also known as The Hague, where things like war crimes and genocide are prosecuted. You may have heard about them recently, since they put out an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, I don't want to say that we all should have known that the US was doing some torturing, but it's not like the Bush administration was particularly secretive about wanting to do things to detainees that was outside the law. The black site, removing the Geneva Convention, withdrawing from any kind of accountability. I wonder what they're trying to do. But the second thing about this Sharif storyline, and perhaps more important, is that while the West Wing is portraying torture as something real Americans would never do, it also, not so subtly, endorses the practice. After all, the reason Bartlett rejects the intel from Russia is not because torture is wrong, or because it produces false confessions, but instead because it wouldn't be usable in a court of law.
Well, I'm no lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that's inadmissible.
Beneath this is the implied conclusion that torture does produce correct and actionable results, even though it has been long understood that a person being tortured will tell you just about anything you want to hear to stop the torture. I mean, the Pentagon itself admitted as much in 2002 in a memo from its chief lawyer, reading, "The application of extreme physical and or psychological duress, torture, has some serious operational deficits, most notably the potential to result in unreliable information." But on the West Wing, Bartlett is eventually convinced to assassinate Sharif based off of this torture-induced intel. How? Well, his chief of staff essentially calls him a soy boy.
This is the most horrifying part of your liberalism. You think there are moral absolutes.
There are moral absolutes.
Apparently not. He's killed innocent people. He'll kill more, so we have to end him. The village idiot comes to that conclusion before the Nobel laureate.
You don't want to assassinate someone based off of shaky evidence? Well, you must be a cuck then. It is actually because this confession would be inadmissible in American court that Bartlett is convinced to assassinate him.
I want him tried. That can't happen. I understand.
And this kind of double argument that torture is against the law and we would never do that, while also absolutely justifying it because sometimes, the law needs to be broken.
Yeah, listen, I don't think this is going to come as a galloping shock to anyone here, but last May, I ordered a special ops unit to kill Abdul Sharif.
Is exactly the kind of argument that would be made once the torture program went public, with Bush himself forcefully denying any wrongdoing.
Anything we do to that effort, to that end, in this effort, any activity we conduct is within the law. We do not torture.
And Vice President Cheney justifying its use and bragging about how effective it was.
I'm more concerned with bad guys who got out and were released than I am with a few that, in fact, were innocent.
25% of the detainees, though, 25% turned out to be innocent. They were
where are you going to draw the line, Chuck? How are you going to know?
Is that too high? Is that you're okay with that margin for
I have no problem as long as we achieve our objective.
Cultural critic Maggie Nelson calls this the Bush-Cheney dyad in her book The Art of Cruelty, writing, "Bush spoke the voice of delusion. It never happened. It will never happen. Cheney, the voice of justification. We had to do it. We should still be doing it." The average citizen can then ricochet between these two irreconcilable collaborative poles until desensitization sets in. And I think that the West Wing was one of the first places we could see this dyad in action. Yeah, Bartlett bristles at torture and assassination as not the way we do things.
That's not my objection, sir. It's just wrong.
While ultimately embracing both of them as effective and necessary in order to maintain national security.
I know. But you have to do it anyway.
Later, in October 2002, about a month after those mushroom cloud comments from Condoleezza Rice, the West Wing even depicted an armed conflict between Kumar and Israel, where Israel drops bombs on Kumar as a preemptive strike.
Kumar, of course, considers an attack on its soil to be an act of war, so we are, as always, one bad bottle of tequila away from all-out war in West Asia.
The West Wing is, unsurprisingly, incredibly sympathetic to Israel here, refusing to acknowledge this military strike on a foreign country as an act of war, and goes out of its way to say that the only reason Israel would ever do this is if they had a really good reason.
Israel launched an unwarranted, illegal, unilateral airstrike against the people of Kumar.
The airstrike was neither unwarranted nor was it against the people of Kumar. It was against two Bahi terrorist camps. Yet your intelligence services seem ready to tell the Arab world that it was Israel.
A state that sanctions covert assassination.
Of terrorists.
Again, this storyline is not explicitly about the US's impending invasion of Iraq, but it did start airing just 6 days after Congress passed the Iraq resolution, authorizing President Bush to use military force in the country. And between that context and the previous Kumar plotlines on the show, I think the message being sent to liberal audiences is pretty clear. A preemptive strike is justified, and we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't have a great reason. 1 month before Bush gave a 2002 speech calling for a doctrine of preemptive strikes.
If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long.
The West Wing had General Fitzwallace make the case for assassinations and preemptive strikes himself, waxing poetically about the times of yore, and making the case that, well, things are just so different now. The world's so crazy. We can't possibly be held to the standard of war crime.
The Battle of Agincourt. This was like a polo match. The battles were observed by heralds, and they picked the winners. And if a soldier laid down his arms, he was treated humanely. And the international laws that you're talking about, this is where a lot of them were written. At a time and a place where a person could tell between peacetime and wartime. Pregnant women are delivering bombs. You're talking to me about international laws? The laws of nature don't even apply here.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
Except that's just completely fucking false. After the Battle of Agincourt, King Henry executed all the French prisoners of war. He just killed them all. When I was researching this, I thought, oh, maybe Sorkin's just a dork. He only knows about the Battle of Agincourt from the Shakespeare play. But then I checked, and Billy Shakes wrote the executions into the play. I knew Sorkin had never read a history book, but perhaps more damning to him, he also hasn't read Shakespeare? West Wing superfan Lin-Manuel Miranda will be so sad.
And I'm Toby Ziegler with the drop, and what kind of day has it been? Miss Lynn spitting the truth, Agent Butterfield level detail on this track while you got that Black Mirror Wayne retail.
If the West Wing is my 9/11, that song hit the second tower of my sanity. It's gone now. By the time Colin Powell presented false evidence in front of the UN in February 2003,
indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
The American people were all too ready to buy the idea that an invasion was both necessary and justified. Today, we know that Iraq never had weapons of mass destruction, and eventually the CIA admitted that there were no WMDs in Iraq and that there had never been an active program in place to develop them.
Chief Weapons Inspector Charles Dulfer has now issued a comprehensive report that Iraq did not have the weapons that our intelligence believed were there.
So, was it reasonable to invade Iraq for national security reasons? Absolutely not. And at the same time, the West Wing coincidentally made the case that a fictional Arab country was a state sponsor of terrorism, that preemptive strikes in the region were justified. I wouldn't say this is an explicit endorsement of the Bush administration's reasoning, but it definitely goes along with it. And we still see this in modern American politics all over the place, particularly in the largest military action being taken against an Arab population right now, Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza. Democrats and Republicans alike paint it as something Israel is doing defensively, to protect its national security, even while Israel clearly escalates offensive attacks, like how its pager attack that targeted Lebanese citizens drew praise from Senate Democrats. Or how Congress has remained largely silent as Israel prevents international aid from reaching the region. Instead, they insist that
Israel has a right to defend itself.
Israel has the right to defend itself.
Israel has the right to defend itself.
The United States recognizes Israel's absolute right to defend itself.
Despite the fact that the country's cabinet has been pretty explicit that they're going to conquer the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, well, actually, the big news just now, overnight, was that the Israeli cabinet just approved plans to really take over the entire Gaza Strip and to occupy it indefinitely. There's been no timeline placed on this, but that's the idea.
And that's because while liberals and conservatives might disagree on just what constitutes a national security threat, they both agreed on where that threat was coming from. Reason number 2, from scary brown people.
The world will be free when we finally shake off the rusted chains of tyranny.
Yes.
Whether in the guise of fascist dictatorship,
You getting nervous?
or economic slavery, or ethnic hostility.
A little nervous?
Or, wait for it, the crushing yoke of Islamic fanaticism.
This episode of The West Wing aired on February 6th, 2002. Ironically, one day before George W. Bush signed that executive order denying Geneva Convention protections to Al-Qaeda and Taliban detainees. There, crazed lunatics hell-bent on violence and retribution, and we're different because we're white. I think that's the point here, right?
In the deserts of Arabia, are there any rational decisions?
The argument made by the West Wing that Arab countries with Muslim majority populations were inherently violent was all over liberal discourse in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. For example, in The American Prospect, a publication so progressive that when you hit a broken link, it tells you, this link is broken, just like the neoliberal order. Yeah, well, in that publication, writer and MacArthur Genius Grant recipient Paul Berman wrote that the new enemy of liberals everywhere was the radical Arab nationalist and Islamic fundamentalist. And he declared Islamists as the heirs of the 20th century totalitarians, comparing Saddam Hussein's government to Nazis, communists, and Catholics? You gotta love some old school, the Pope is going to rule America if we elect JFK bigotry. Joke's on you, Catholic Church. Your Pope couldn't stand a single meeting with our vice president. He's not even the guy in charge. Wait until you meet him. I imagine that if the Pope met with Trump, it'd be kind of like that scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. My point is, many liberals saw a military intervention in the Middle East, whether it was about overthrowing the Taliban or toppling Saddam Hussein, did you see what I did there, as being about defeating the backwards ideas of Islam, about bringing the Arab world out of the Dark Ages and into the Enlightenment.
Well, if the Arabs are mad at us, we must be doing something right.
West Wing characters argued for the inherent irrationality of Arab populations, portraying them as having a moral compass straight out of medieval times.
Your government actively supports the Baha'i. In addition to stoning adulterers and banning anything written after and including the Gutenberg Bible, they preach the overthrow of our government and violence against our citizens.
Or they would denigrate the very idea of an Arab government at all.
Members of my government? I think he was talking about 2 sock puppets and a beanie baby.
So now all Palestinians are terrorists?
The keffiyeh fits.
That's enough.
And the show did all of this while completely erasing the history of American involvement in the region.
Grotesque oppression isn't okay, just because it's been institutionalized. If you ask me, we should have gotten into the game 3-4 decades ago, but they're coming for us now, so it's time to saddle up.
The West Wing frequently implied that the Arab world, TM, was opposed to the US in a kind of metaphysical sense. That the extremist terrorist violence that came from the region simply came down to their culture and their religion. Just weeks after 9/11, the West Wing aired a special episode aimed at trying to understand the political moment. When a student asks how this conflict with the Arab world began,
how did what all start? Well, this.
The First Lady goes into a long speech about how actually it dates all the way back to the life of Abraham. It's really an ancient and divine struggle between Jews and Muslims.
And so it began. The Jews, the sons of Isaac. The Arabs, the sons of Ishmael.
Of course, just like the Battle of Agincourt tangent, is a really narrow understanding of history.
It's like bad Shakespeare.
Extremist regimes often gain power when things become desperate, not because of what's written in the Quran. For example, in Iraq, a 2004 Oxford Research International poll found that a majority of Iraqis favored a secular government, ranking a government which follows religious ideals as the least important option. But this was during a pretty chill time in the war, and as insurgent violence escalated throughout the year, most notably in the Battle of Fallujah, the Iraqi people became a bit more desperate. By August, after a year and a half of American occupation with no end in sight, a different survey found that only 23% of Iraqis preferred a secular government over a religious state. Although it should be noted that that survey was a partisan one conducted by the Republican Party, so maybe there was a bit of an agenda there. But still, this is in line with the same exact pattern we've seen play out for the past half century, with the US propping up extremist groups in the name of fighting communism, like with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, or supporting more than a few coups in Iraq, and plunging other regions into political turmoil and leaving extremism as the only avenue available to desperate people. Kind of like how the United States has funded the ethnic cleansing campaign in Palestine and has driven support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. But this kind of historical context is rarely brought up by liberals, and in fact was outright dismissed by the West Wing, which portrayed increased American presence in the Middle East as us finally getting off our butts to do something.
I'll do whatever you want, Mr. President, but I think we should be more engaged over there, not less.
The closest the show gets to grappling with the history of the region is in this season 5 episode, when James Cromwell guest stars as the most based president in American history.
His people hate us.
Of course they hate us. Because we support their oppressors, because we are their oppressors.
But even this is portrayed as a debate with many different sides. In that same argument, Toby says this.
Mr. President, it just seems to me that most Muslims on the Arabian Peninsula believe they must choose between the law of Allah and the laws of man.
And that episode ends with Bartlett reading a note that basically says, Islamic fundamentalism is a threat to our democracy. I think this is pretty indicative of the ways in which some liberals, even to this day, paint the fringe beliefs of terrorist groups as the real face of Islam, and that this dangerous ideology needs to be eradicated.
You're saying that Islamophobia is not a real thing, that if you're critical of something...
Well, it's not a real thing when we do it.
Right.
Well, no,
it really isn't.
I'm not denying that certain people are bigoted against Muslims as people, and that's a problem.
Big of you.
But Ben, we have to be able to criticize bad ideas. And
of course we do. No liberal doesn't want to criticize bad ideas.
But Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas.
You see, it's not that we hate brown people, it's that we're going to assume all sorts of things about a population of over 1 billion people and hate them all for subscribing to that ideology. They're totally different things, okay? I mean, let's go back to that phrase Paul Berman used to describe the new totalitarians: radical Arab nationalists and Islamic fundamentalists. I think that choice of words is pretty telling. Nationalism has nothing inherently to do with religion, and is all about wanting autonomy from the kind of Middle Eastern meddling that the West has been doing since colonial times. It's not the same as Sharia law, like, at all. It's apples and oranges. It's watermelons and arranged marriages. They're just not comparable. But this combo of nationalism and fundamentalism was really potent because it gave a lot of liberals permission to be racist as fuck towards Muslims.
The USTR will go crazy and say that we're not considering global trade. Committee members will go crazy and say I haven't consulted enough. And the Arab world will just go indiscriminately crazy.
Michael Walzer, editor emeritus of the left-wing magazine Dissent, basically said so in 2002, scolding leftists for ignoring the inherent violence of religion, writing, "Whenever writers on the left say that the root cause of terror is global inequality or human poverty, the assertion is in fact a denial that religious motives really count. I mean, sure, we've been involved in countless coups to install governments that will sell us oil, but that's got nothing to do with why they're upset with us, okay? It's definitely because they read it in their magic book." This idea was echoed by Toby when he explicitly blamed Islam as the reason for poor education and anti-American sentiment in the Middle East.
Thousands of madrasas teaching children nothing but the Quran and to hate America. What do we see about that? Their religion forbids them from playing the trumpet, so be it. But I want those kids to look at a globe, be exposed to social sciences, history, some literature.
You see, on the West Wing, there's a pretty notable difference in the way the show talks about terrorism carried out by Arab people versus white people.
Sinn Féin is a political party, in fact, the oldest in Ireland.
And the political wing of the IRA,
sir,
a terrorist cell.
And I think we have to be careful how we use the word terrorist.
And while the West Wing often tries to draw lines between Islam and Islamic fundamentalists,
I don't remember having to explain to Italians that our problem wasn't with them, but with Mussolini. Why does the U.S. have to take every Arab country out for an ice cream cone?
And while George W. Bush was given a lot of brownie points for saying this,
the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam.
There's a kind of backhanded racism at work here. According to Khalid Bedouin, a law professor and author of the book American Islamophobia, Bush was sort of constructing a new kind of Muslim binary, if you will. Like kind of a good versus bad Muslim binary. That the kind of Muslims that he lauded and the kind of Muslims that he would characterize as peaceful are the individuals who would not engage in specific kinds of activity that was viewed with suspicion by the state. In other words, it is precisely our level of suspicion that determines whether you're a good Muslim or a bad Muslim.
I want to talk about the applied mathematics degree.
Yeah?
What are you doing working for a White House staff secretary?
What do you mean?
We don't do a lot of math around here.
Well, my interests shifted. I became interested in policy.
You're aware that the intelligence agencies routinely recruit top mathematicians, oftentimes out of MIT, and train them to be cryptographers?
It's literally the Family Guy meme. Again, this Islamophobia is still on full display in modern American politics. From Trump's Muslim ban to mainstream conservatives and liberals alike labeling those calling for an end to the genocide in Gaza as terrorist sympathizers, supporting violent police crackdowns on free speech. But I think that if that narrative had simply been, they're brown and scary, I'm not sure how many liberals would have signed on to something so mask off. Instead, they laundered this racism through a much more heroic lens. Reason number 3. So we have to save them.
What's Egypt gonna think? Or Pakistan?
That freedom and democracy are coming soon to a theater near them, so get dressed.
In the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, having found no weapons of mass destruction, the narrative quickly shifted. Despite many Democrats having questioned whether there were weapons of any kind to be found before the invasion, it didn't seem to temper their support for the war. As the Washington Post noted in 2003, while Nancy Pelosi had voted against the Iraq resolution and accused the administration of exaggerating Iraq's nuclear capabilities, she ultimately didn't think it was that big of a deal if we found weapons or not, saying, "I am sort of agnostic on it. I salute the president for the goal of removing weapons of mass destruction." This idea was reflected in polling. By April 2000, 2003, public opinion had completely shifted, with a Gallup poll showing that 58% of Americans thought war with Iraq was justified even without WMDs, up from 38% before the invasion. Why did weapons all of a sudden not matter when the entire lead-up had been about preemptively striking Saddam Hussein before he could get us? Well, that Gallup poll offers another explanation. 62% of Americans viewed the war through a humanitarian lens. Now, this wasn't completely out of nowhere. Whenever Bush would mention weapons of mass destruction, he would be quick to note that while he was sure Saddam Hussein would use them on America, those weapons were also a threat to the Iraqi people.
It has given shelter and support to terrorism and practices terror against its own people.
Following the 1991 Gulf War, Iraq experienced a number of political uprisings, and there were several reports of Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons on his own people in a brutal crackdown. After all, he had deployed chemical weapons on civilians during the Iran-Iraq War. How do we know that? Oh, it's because the US gave him satellite imagery, maps, and intelligence to carry out those attacks. Whoopsie! But there was no denying that Saddam was a bad guy. I mean, the dude is Satan's boyfriend, so he's gotta be evil. He's gay. Bad. Sorry, I'm just trying to really embody early aughts America. That was the vibe in the early 2000s, right? Saddam definitely killed those revolutionaries, whether it was with nerve gas or not, and his dictatorship, like almost all dictatorships, was brutal and oppressive. I mean, who could possibly argue that it was better for him to stay in power?
I think we will look back and say whatever the mistakes, and we made some, Iraq is a better place today than it was under Saddam Hussein.
And this rationale for war was really effective in getting liberals on board. Peter Beinart, then editor of The New Republic, a liberal left magazine, painted the deaths of Iraqis killed in the 1991 uprisings as a betrayal by America, and justified the war as a redemption, writing, "American tanks and bombs are often the only things that bring evil to heel." New York Times opinion columnist Bill Keller wrote in 2003, "We reluctant hawks may disagree among ourselves about the most compelling logic for war, protecting America, relieving oppressed Iraqis, or reforming the Middle East. But we generally agree that the logic for standing pat does not hold." Washington Post columnist Michael Kelly wrote, "I understand why some dislike the idea and fear the ramifications of America as a liberator, but I do not understand why they do not see that anything is better than life with your face under the boot." Yeah! Some people look around and they see a boot on a face and they think oppressor. And Michael Kelly thinks, why can't that boot be us? I wonder what Kelly thinks about the war in retrospect. Oh wait, never mind. Turns out he died 5 weeks after writing that as the first journalist killed in combat. Now that's dedication to the cause, baby! To fully understand this idea that bombing the living shit out of a country is a way to free it, we have to try to put ourselves in the shoes of an early 2000s Democrat who had just witnessed 2 major atrocities.
Hidden from the Serbs, Wim Dijkema was documenting the first stages of genocide.
1.5 million Rwandans, nearly 20% of the country's entire population, trying desperately to survive one more day in this relentlessly inhospitable corner of Zaire.
These 2 high-profile genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia heavily influenced the way American liberals thought about military intervention. In 1994 in Rwanda, at least 500,000 people were killed in the span of just 100 days. And in 1995, thousands of Bosnian Muslims were killed in the aftermath of the fall of Yugoslavia. In Rwanda, the international community was slow to respond, and the United States declined to intervene, despite having full knowledge of the scale of the killings. In Bosnia, however, US and NATO forces were able to bring the conflict to a close. So liberals saw this as a new purpose in a post-Cold War world, that the US should use its military for humanitarian interventions to stop mass death before it happens. Bill Keller said as much in that New York Times piece, writing, "Many of these wary warmongers are baby boom liberals whose aversion to the deployment of American power was formed by Vietnam, but who had a kind of epiphany along the way, for most of us in the vicinity of Bosnia." And this is an argument that the West Wing made rather forcefully. About a month before the US officially invaded Iraq, the show began a story arc about the fictional country of Equatorial Kundu, a clear allegory for the Rwandan genocide.
Thousands upon thousands of African children will die unless the US intervenes.
This storyline sees the birth of the Bartlett Doctrine, a philosophy of using force for purely humanitarian reasons.
We're for freedom of speech everywhere. We're for freedom to worship everywhere. We're for freedom to learn for everybody. And because in our time you can build a bomb in your country and bring it to my country, what goes on in your country is very much my business. And so we are for freedom from tyranny everywhere.
Now, to be perfectly clear, the US and international community at large could have and should have intervened in Rwanda. It is without a doubt one of the most horrific displays of murder in all of human history, the scale of which is simply impossible for our puny human brains to process.
It is not like anything I've ever seen in 30 years as a reporter. It is, I think, the standard against which all future tragedies will be measured.
And I think that it's very likely that the US would have intervened if it had been occurring in a whiter country, like Bosnia. It's pretty telling to me that so many of these liberal hawks point to Bosnia as an eye-opening moment, rather than Rwanda. In 1994, the editors at the New Republic were pretty explicit about this in their article, Why Not Rwanda? Writing, potential reverberations for the rest of humanity from ethnic cleansing in the heart of Europe are simply greater than those of ethnic cleansing in Rwanda. I mean, remember, they can't even tell time in Africa, and you can't help people that can't tell time. I mean, if they don't have clocks, what are you going to do? How do you even know when it's time to bomb them into freedom? But I think the timing and the context of when this Kundu plotline aired is crucially important. This storyline is specifically designed to get its audience to support the military occupation of a foreign country for humanitarian reasons.
No country has ever had a doctrine of intervention when only humanitarian interests were at stake. That streak's going to end Sunday at noon.
That's also objectively not true. Belgium advocated for humanitarian intervention in 1999 when the West Wing began, and a bunch of West African states used the same justification in Liberia in 1990 and Sierra Leone in 1998. I swear to God, the writers of this show have never read a history book. Bartlett even decides to send in the troops by watching a Laurel and Hardy movie side by side with the news. The message couldn't be more clear. American troops equal good. In the next episode of The West Wing, which aired on February 19th, 2003, Bartlett deals with French opposition to his Kundu operation, and the French jokes are everywhere.
The French have denied us access to their airspace. I'm not sure why they think we're going to need it to get from here to Africa, but what the hell?
I mean, he literally berates his daughter's French boyfriend.
On the other hand, 20% of your youth is unemployed. They're just living to live.
Yes, that is right. But sir, we have the best public health care and pension in the world. State-financed pensions are equal almost to income levels.
Yeah, it helps when someone else is picking up the bigger ticket items like a national defense.
For those of you too young to remember, this is exactly the same time period where the French opposed the US invasion of Iraq. And Americans got so pissed that they started renaming French fries as freedom fries. Literally that same month, February 2003.
The refusal of France to support the U.S. in Iraq, triggering a symbolic protest. Instead of offering French fries, some restaurants across the country now calling them freedom fries. That message also being heard in Washington, now being served in congressional cafeterias. Freedom fries, and instead of French toast, you can get freedom toast.
Not exactly what I would call counter-programming. In fact, The West Wing is so dedicated to this idea of the US as liberator that Josh invokes the Holocaust to support their intervention in Iraq. I mean in Kundu.
Not for nothing, but if we'd been the world's policemen in the 30s, you and I,
we would have had a lot more relatives.
That's right.
This didn't come from nowhere. In a 2021 retrospective in Slate, Frank Foer, who had been a young writer at the New Republic at the time of the invasion, told the magazine that at a place like the New Republic, which, not to put too fine a point on, had a lot of Jewish intellectuals like myself living in the shadow of the Holocaust, were really excited about the notion that the United States could use its power as a force for good to prevent genocides all around the world. And the specter of the Holocaust is often brought up on the West Wing when discussing Middle Eastern foreign policy.
When you think of Afghanistan, think of Poland. When you think of the Taliban, think of the Nazis. When you think of the citizens of Afghanistan, think of Jews in concentration camps.
Often this is raised to paint some Muslims as evil, with the not-so-subtle implication being that Arab nations pose an existential threat to Israel because it's Jewish, and not because it's an apartheid state where Palestinians live in an open-air prison. Now, I think there are good arguments to be made for humanitarian intervention. I think that preventing genocide is, drumroll, good. I know, that's a hot take for an American these days, with all of the America stuff. Josh isn't wrong that the US could have done a lot more to mitigate the Holocaust. Although I think I probably would have started with accepting Jewish refugees rather than jumping straight to world's policemen. Because I think it's equally crucial to understand that war is a blunt instrument.
You can nitpick all you like about this issue of war on Iraq, war against Saddam Hussein, but when those bombs start to fall, they will fall on Iraqis, and they will largely not distinguish the politics, however carefully the targeting is done.
I mean, here's footage from the invasion of Iraq, with the US displaying a strategy called shock and awe.
Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth. An inferno. ITV News cameras recorded the barrage from hotel balconies, and it was a truly chilling sight.
This isn't just an attack on bricks and mortar. It is an assault on the human senses.
I'm still not totally sure how you can be saving the people being exploded under the weight of thousands of pounds of bombs. It just seems like they're not gonna be safe. I mean, the shock and awe manual literally compares the strategy to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and aimed to deliver, quote, nearly incomprehensible levels of massive destruction directed at influencing society writ large. Ah, yes. Remember all those people we saved from the terror of Imperial Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? They sure didn't have to suffer at the hands of a totalitarian dictatorship at all once we were done with them. Bombs may be fiery explosions, but you know what else is warm to the touch? A hug. Think about that one. In 2004, Human Rights Watch, a group that advocated for humanitarian intervention in both Rwanda and Bosnia, wrote that the war in Iraq did not qualify. There were times in the past when the killing was so intense that humanitarian intervention would have been justified. But on the eve of the latest Iraq war, no one contends that the Iraqi government was engaged in killing of anywhere near this magnitude, or had been for some time. Better late than never is not a justification for humanitarian intervention. But this viewpoint of the US military as liberators has remained really ingrained in the liberal mind, perhaps best summed up by Aaron Sorkin himself in a 2019 appearance on CNN.
My father, who passed away a few years ago, fought in World War II. And he, like most people from his generation, from the greatest generation, he doesn't tell a lot of war stories. You kind of have to pull it out of him. But he would talk about his unit going into a village in Europe, and you could hear villagers say, "Thank God the Americans are here." Now, people don't say that right now, and it's because of Donald Trump.
Yeah. You think that's because of Donald Trump? That started with the Orange Man? Let's ask the citizens of North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, the Congo, the Dominican Republic, Bolivia, Lebanon, Grenada, Libya, Panama, Iraq, Palestine, Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Pakistan. I wonder what they think when they see American troops invading their countries. It's probably not welcome, but yes, I'm sure it's all Trump's fault, and not even say American troops smiling and posing for photos in one of their many black sites dedicated to torturing random Middle Eastern people. Aaron Sorkin, you're a fucking moron. It's a rosy paternalistic viewpoint of America, shaped entirely by a very small and specific slice of World War II history, ignoring, for example, how at the same time of World War II, the US government had placed 120,000 of its own citizens in concentration camps. Good thing we don't send American citizens to concentration camps anymore. That would be alarming.
Freedom and democracy are coming soon to a theater near them, so get dressed.
But this idea of saving the Middle East was incredibly potent amongst liberals. Which brings us to our bonus super secret hidden reason for killing millions of Arabs. Reason 3.5. Do it for the ladies! Nowhere was this narrative of saving the Middle East more apparent than in the spotlighting of women's rights in these countries.
Good morning. I'm Laura Bush, and I'm delivering this week's radio address to kick off a worldwide effort to focus on the brutality against women and children by the Al-Qaeda terrorist network and the regime it supports in Afghanistan, the Taliban.
That's First Lady Laura Bush on November 17th, 2001, giving the first weekly radio address delivered entirely by a First Lady. In it, she made the case that the war on terror was really a war to free women from the tyranny of Islamic fundamentalists.
The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women.
It was an idea echoed by tons of liberal opinion writers, like Christopher Hitchens, who wrote in The Guardian in 2001 that Islamic extremists were fighting for the right to throw acid in the faces of unveiled women in Kabul and Karachi. Over the next few months, the American people were inundated with news programs introducing them to the burqa, a garb worn by women in some cultures as a form of modesty.
For the women of Afghanistan, the veil, the burqa,
has become the symbol of the Taliban's power. Even women who fled to the United States have been afraid to remove that veil of repression, fearing reprisals on their family back home and from Taliban supporters here in America.
But as anthropologist Laila Abu-Lagad wrote in 2002, most public conversations about the state of women's rights in Arab countries like Afghanistan tended to revolve less around their actual rights and more around the spectacle of their difference. After all, there are fashion norms in many countries, and the hijab has even been sometimes a symbol of the revolutionary involvement of women in some Muslim countries. To Abu-Lagad, this outrage seems selective, since she had never received a petition from such women defending the right of Palestinian women to safety from Israeli bombing, or daily harassment at checkpoints, asking the United States to consider its support for a government that had dispossessed them, closed them out from work and citizenship rights, refused them the most basic freedoms. And from 2001 to 2003, The West Wing dedicated multiple episodes to the plight of oppressed Muslim women. It was one of Press Secretary C.J. Craig's favorite talking points.
Saudi news is reporting that rescuers were prevented from getting to several female students by the religious police.
Outraged? I'm barely surprised. This is a country where women are allowed to drive a car. They're not allowed to be in the company of any man other than a close relative. They're required to adhere to a dress code that would make a Mary Noel Nunn look like Malibu Barbie. They beheaded 121 people last year for robbery, rape, and drug trafficking.
You know what, CJ? I agree. The death penalty is barbaric. No civilized country should have one. And honestly, any country that has one should probably be dismantled. Oh, to the credit of The West Wing, the show often pointed out issues that were much more broad than being fashion police. The show was famous for calling out a similarly regressive line of thinking in the American religious right.
Leviticus
18:22.
chapter and verse. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions while I had you here. I'm interested in selling my youngest daughter into slavery as sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. She's a Georgetown sophomore, speaks fluent Italian, always cleared the table when it was her turn. What would a good price for her be?
But there was still quite the double standard. None of these liberals ever made the case that we should bomb Utah to overthrow the repressive regime of Mormons, who seem to have some pretty conservative views on women as well. Although I am basing that entirely off of a few episodes of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives.
That is important to me, and I do feel like I've established that here.
I don't really care. Peak television. As I pointed out in the last episode, Josh literally dismisses the idea that far-right violence from Christians targeting abortion clinics was comparable to Islamic terrorist violence.
Islamic extremist is to Islamic as blank is to Christianity.
Christian fundamentalists.
No. Guys, the Christian right may not be your cup of tea, but they're not blowing stuff up.
While the show would call out Christian sexism, it was far more agitated by the sexism on the other side of the globe, implying pretty strongly that, yeah, some Christians might be hostile to women, but Islam itself is fundamentally bigoted.
Things are a lot less comic for women who aren't allowed to attend school or have jobs. They're not allowed to be unaccompanied and oftentimes get publicly stoned to death for crimes like not wearing a veil. I don't have to tell you, they don't need to shout at a soccer match. They're never going to go to one.
Now, personally, I find this outrage over sexism to be a little rich coming from the West Wing. I mean, 2 episodes before Josh says this, Bartlett's secretary is berated by not 1, not 2, but 3 different men about going to buy a car for herself because, you know, women be bad at cars.
Why do men think women can't buy a car without a man?
It's an old stereotype, Mrs. Allen. Did you get the extended service warning?
No.
Women.
You want to know what happens to her once she finally gets her own car? She's immediately hit by a drunk driver.
There was a drunk driver, and they ran the light at 18th and Potomac. They ran it at a high speed.
Charlie's show, right?
No. She's dead.
Pancaked by drunk dump truck driver.
The West Wing is a show just unbelievably jam-packed with casual misogyny. Here's a compilation.
Toby, come quick. Sam's getting his ass kicked by a girl.
When you have a few moments, I would like to discuss the hiring of blonde and leggy fascists.
Don't interrupt me, lady.
Where'd you get the bathrobe?
The gym.
The bathrobe's at the gym?
In the women's locker room.
But not the men's.
Yeah.
Now that's outrageous. There's 1,000 men working here and 50 women.
Yeah, and it's the bathrobes that's outrageous.
And we sit and we have coffee and we have Danish in the hope that calmer and, dare I say, prettier heads prevail.
Oh, I miss patronizing sexist Toby.
What's wrong with it? Sounds like it was written by a high school girl.
Is there something wrong with the way women writes?
There usually is when she's in high school.
You still don't know my name, do you?
It's Gertrude.
It's not.
It's not like there's a moral imperative for the White House to get behind what?
Equity
and insurance coverage for contraception or whatever it is the ladies want. More money for sewing notions and whatnot. The only reason you're not out there with them is because, I don't know, because you're a woman or something.
And those are just from October 2000 to December 2001. But this argument that the women of the Middle East needed to be saved by us enlightened feminists really worked. In his New York Times bestseller, Paul Berman would even go on to declare the Afghanistan war as the first feminist war in all of history. The first war in which women's rights were proclaimed at the start to be a major war aim. Author Rafia Zakaria agrees, although she's a lot more depressed about it. American women were liberated, and now they, along with male service members, would go to Afghanistan to root out the misogynist regime of the Taliban. America thus was not a cruel superpower bombing a small and hapless nation, but a force for good that would actually help bring gender equality to a war-torn country.
So women are in control of the machinery of war. And I want to ask you, is this a cause for celebration? Diversity by itself may simply mean that previously marginalized individuals have been recruited to guarantee a more efficient operation of oppressive systems.
On The West Wing, we can see this dynamic at work in the evolution of C.J. Craig. In season 2, she is emphatic about scaling back the military budget.
How about we discuss new defense spending being down to $300 billion from $400 billion 10 years ago? Is that personal?
No, sir, I think that's about the Cold War ending 10 years ago and America not needing to spend quite so much money defending itself against a country that can't bake bread.
But as soon as 9/11 happens, she becomes a champion of expanded CIA surveillance and American militarism.
Maybe this would be a good time for a chorus of our maligned little brother civil liberties.
Liberty schmibberties.
C.J. Craig, ladies and gentlemen.
You know of a way to do this without tapping some phones? So it's time to give the intelligence agencies the money and the manpower they need.
A few months later, CJ proudly champions the idea that Arab women need some good old-fashioned white saving.
We're not fighting a war with Kumar.
Well, this isn't the point, but we will. Of course we will. Of course we'll be fighting a war with Kumar one day, and you know it. They beat women, Nancy. They hate women. The only reason they keep Kumari women alive is to make more Kumari men.
So what do you want me to do about it?
How about instead of suggesting that we sell the guns to them, suggesting that we shoot the guns at them?
Now, this is not to say that the laws of some Middle Eastern countries have not been oppressive to women. They obviously were, and continue to be in many ways. Malala reached international fame because she was targeted for assassination for her activism around women's access to education. But I think it's pretty hard to make the argument that the wars on terror have made life better for women anywhere. Take, for example, when an American bomb killed 7 Afghan women and girls in 2012 while they were gathering firewood. Or this 2008 airstrike targeting a wedding, killing 37 Afghan civilians. Or this other 2008 airstrike targeting a wedding, including 39 women and children. These are far from isolated incidents, although the full extent of death may be impossible to ever know, since, according to Amnesty International, there's no legal recourse available to victims, since US military is immune to the Afghan legal system. The Watson Institute estimates that the war in Afghanistan has created some 2 million widows, to say nothing of the sons, brothers, and fathers killed in the conflict. The Institute did not have a number for Iraqi widows that I could find. We liberated these women from their families. Good job, America. Before the war began in 2001, food insecurity affected 62% of the population in Afghanistan, 9% of children under 5 were experiencing acute malnutrition, and 80% of the country was living in poverty. Not great, but 21 years later, food insecurity was up to 92%, child malnutrition 50%, and poverty up to 97%. All while women's rights have not meaningfully changed. But despite this, known liars and war criminals like Condoleezza Rice can continue to invoke women as a reason to continue forever wars that leave countries in ruin, to the applause of liberal centrists.
And I hope we're not going to abandon the women of Afghanistan. You know, when...
It's also been a prominent talking point used to defend Israel's genocidal actions in Gaza. Supporters will often appeal to liberals by talking about the rights of women and queer folks in Gaza and other Arab nations as justification for killing them. All while Israel's Minister of National Security calls the rape of prisoners legitimate. You know, because they're feminists. To learn more about Israel's history of using women to recruit and market their military, check out my video on NCIS. But again, it's hard for me to look at pictures of Gaza or Rafah today and think that women there are better off than they were before. I mean, how is this better for women? Reason number 4. Because we're the good guys.
Believe me, if we were able to enforce U.S. law around the world, I'd retire and go scuba diving.
While some may have found the war on terror to be some kind of admirable humanitarian intervention, saving women and the victims of brutal regimes by bombing them to death, to believe that this would be a net positive for the region requires some truly mind-blowing arrogance and really bright rose-colored glasses. Those things are just solid red. You know, from the bloodlust.
I say we should have gone in there with 4 tank divisions and turned the place into a casino.
Manifestist.
Bet your ass.
Because the flip side of this idea of saving the innocent civilians of the Middle East is that Americans were the ones to do it. Because we're enlightened. Because we're better. And the West Wing championed this idea pretty hard, explicitly saying that the reason America was targeted on September 11th was because, well, we're just so liberal and enlightened.
So what bothers them about us? Well, the variety of cheers alone coming from the cheap seats in Giant Stadium when they're playing the Cowboys is enough for a jihad, to say nothing of street corners lined church next to synagogue, next to mosque, newspapers that can print anything they want, and women who can do anything they want. This is a plural society. That means we accept more than one idea. It offends them.
The show was all too willing to conflate America with the very concepts of democracy and freedom as well.
And they seem to be using anti-American rhetoric, yet demanding democratic reforms.
It's what this country was built on. Everyone's from somewhere else, someplace less free.
It's a perspective that, again, eliminates any kind of historical or political context, and simply makes the war on terror a battle of identities, with each side defined in opposition to its enemy. We're for freedom, so they're for tyranny. We're a democracy, so they must be totalitarians. If you really think about it, they're probably just jealous of us.
We're at war with a plague of jealousy and hatred. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the index patient. Shouldn't that be our focus?
Not only did this approach make extremists seem bigoted, but it also affirmed the goodness of America, that we were inherently good, and it didn't really matter who prosecuted the war. Even when all the evidence indicated that the conservatives inside the Bush administration did not give a fuck about spreading democracy or liberating anyone. In 1998, the conservative think tank Project of the New American Century, PNAC, sent then-President Bill Clinton a letter calling for regime change in Iraq, a letter that was signed by future Bush administration officials like Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and John Bolton. You know John Bolton. He's the guy who's still trying to go to war with Iran. And do you want to know how many times that letter mentioned the word democracy? 0. Turns out conservatives don't really give a fuck about democracy anywhere. Echoing that sentiment in his first presidential debate in 2000, Bush had this to say about the very idea of nation building.
I would be very careful about using our troops as nation builders. I believe the role of the military is to fight and win war, and therefore prevent war from happening in the first place. And so I take my responsibility seriously. And it starts with making sure we rebuild our military power.
I think that last part is the key point. Rebuilding our military power. It was PNAC's main concern, writing in a 2000 report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses that, for the past decade, the health of the armed services has steadily declined. Not merely have their budgets been dramatically reduced, their force structures cut, and their personnel strength sapped, modernization programs and efforts at transformation strangled, but the quality of military life, essential for preserving a volunteer force, has been degraded. That report would go on to complain about how difficult it would be to turn things around on military spending, absent some catastrophic catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. Now, I'm not saying 9/11 was an inside job. Sure, they ignored a lot of pretty obvious warning signs and had dreamed of such an event just a year earlier, and defense spending immediately skyrocketed, enriching all of the people involved in the administration, just like they planned, but that's just called being in the right place at the right time, baby. I don't think 9/11 was an inside job. I think it's kind of just like the Lakers getting Luka Doncic. Like, of course, it just fell into their laps. That's a sports reference for the nerds out there. Just hours after the second tower was hit on September 11th, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld suggested invading Iraq. There was no evidence that Iraq had been involved in the attacks at the time because, you know, they weren't. But Donald Rumsfeld, Donnie the Rum, well, he could give a fuck. In that 2008 oral oral history of the Bush White House, National Security Advisor Richard Clarke recounted the day this way. Rumsfeld said, "You know, we've got to do Iraq." And everyone looked at him like, "What the hell are you talking about?" I made the point certainly that night, and I think Powell acknowledged it, that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. That didn't seem to faze Rumsfeld in the least. You would think that this would be a damning revelation, evidence of just how fraudulent the war had been from the beginning, that if news like this had ever been public, well, we never would have ended up going over there. But you'd be wrong, because less than a year after 9/11, and still before the invasion of Iraq, CBS News reported in 2002 that barely 5 hours after American Airlines Flight 77 plowed into the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Donald H. Rumsfeld was telling his aides to come up with plans for striking Iraq, even though there was no evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the attacks. Like it was public knowledge. Everybody knew they were lying. Maybe liberal hawks were just unable to think of a world in which the goals of the Bush administration might not be the same as their lofty humanitarian aims. But while liberal hawks might have thought of themselves as better than those stupid hicks in the Bush administration, I think their goal was remarkably similar, despite better PR. They also wanted a kind of holy war, to free the Muslim world from the tyranny of Islam.
I don't know what winning looks like. What does it look like? Is it honestly the U.S. flag flying over Mecca? Is that what's going to straighten this out? And if that's the case, why are we postponing that? What are we hoping is going to happen in the meantime?
That somebody will think of something before we have to do the unthinkable.
You're one of the big minds of your generation. Have you thought of anything yet?
And if you're waging a war of good versus evil, you can justify pretty much anything. For example, on November 7th, 2001, just weeks after the passage of the Patriot Act, The West Wing aired an episode called War Crimes, where Leo argued with a general about the US joining the International Criminal Court, The Hague.
Doesn't the world need a permanent standing body?
National sovereignty is at stake. Americans are answerable to no one but their own government and their own law.
If we don't subject ourselves to the treaty, it'll encourage other countries, and you don't think that'll undercut the UN's campaign against war crimes?
Now, the general eventually wins this argument. How? Well, it turns out that this general was Leo's commanding officer in Vietnam, and he had ordered Leo to unwittingly fire on a civilian target.
I was forward air commander. I gave you your directions.
It was a military target.
It was a civilian target. It was a dam. There were 11 civilian casualties.
Why did you tell me that?
Because you could be charged and tried for a war crime.
I love how shook Leo is here, because it's not a good argument. They're talking about Operation Rolling Thunder, a bombing effort that killed literally tens of thousands of civilians. Yeah, I think it would be nice if some people were held accountable for that. Probably not Leo, so much as the guy that you're talking to who literally ordered you to do it, knowingly.
I was forward air commander. I gave you your directions.
That seems to be the real war criminal, but the argument that the show seems to be making here is that, well, we can't be held accountable for war crimes because, you know, America is just so militant that you can never really know if you've done one. We're just always going right up to that line. I mean, what is a war crime, really?
All wars are crimes.
It's literally a dorm room bong hit comment. A year later, Leo would reject the possibility of Bartlett being held accountable for the assassination of Kumar's defense minister in The Hague.
I don't know what would happen to you and me, but I'm pretty sure the president would be invited to see the inside of The Hague.
Yeah, well, they can invite all they want. He ain't going.
Even as the public reasons for the war on terror fell apart in the news, the West Wing kept up its holy war stance, arguing that there really aren't any moderate Muslims.
There are moderate elements on the ascendancy in Iran.
In the Quran, God commanded to kill the wicked and those who do not see the rights of the oppressed and to murder them. If we abide by the Quran, all of us should mobilize to kill. Televised address by President Aliani, moderate.
It put forth the idea that starting an armed conflict in Iran was justified for eerily similar reasons to Iraq.
But the casualties are nothing compared with what might happen should Iran successfully develop a nuclear weapon. They have over 100 nuclear facilities. So it's not a matter of 3 or 4 bombs. It's a matter of 300 or 400, and this regime will not be afraid of selling to the highest bidder.
Just weeks after Chief U.S. Weapons Inspector David Kay resigned because he couldn't find any WMDs, which again had been the main argument that the U.S. made to the UN when they tried to build a coalition to invade Iraq, which the UN rejected, the West Wing aired an episode making the case that actually the UN expects us to do this for them, even if they pretend that they're mad about it.
The UN doesn't want this. They want to wring their hands and censor us after, but they expect us to take care of things like this. And after they've exhausted themselves calling us warmongers and imperialists, they'll go home and quietly drink toast to their relief.
Today, we can still see this appeal to American exceptionalism at work. You see, in order to stay uniquely elite, we also have to be exclusive. We can't abide by outside agitators, whether they're refugees seeking asylum, undocumented workers, or people simply using their free speech rights to protest. While most of us likely associate these things with Trump, both Obama and Biden escalated deportations. Obama massively expanded the surveillance state and used it to target ordinary Muslims, while Biden labeled pro-Palestine protests at Columbia and Yale as anti-Semitic, which laid the groundwork for Trump to use anti-Semitism as a justification for suspending civil rights. And with that liberal support, the war on terror carried on for decades, all while obscuring the real reasons behind it. What were those real reasons? Well, just 2 months after 9/11, Halliburton received a 10-year omnibus military contract. Halliburton, which just so happened to be the company that Vice President Dick Cheney had been CEO of.
Random!
This was the real goal of the Iraq War and the broader war on terror, to enrich the private sector through military contracts and exploit the natural resources of the Middle East. According to the Watson Institute, since the start of the war in Afghanistan, Pentagon spending has totaled over $14 trillion, 1/3 to 1/2 of which went to defense contractors. A large portion of these contracts, 1/4 to 1/3 of all Pentagon contracts in recent years, have gone to just 5 major corporations. The $75 billion in Pentagon contracts received by Lockheed Martin in fiscal year 2020 is well over 1.5 times the entire budget for the State Department and Agency for International Development for that year, which totaled $44 billion. In Afghanistan alone, the US spent over $36 billion in development aid, but spent about 58 times that amount in defense contracts, totaling $2.1 trillion. During the same time period, the West Wing was also making the case for increased military budgets, not just through CJ's complete 180, but also when Mr. Robot over here says that actually, $400 is a very appropriate amount of money to spend on an ashtray.
What was that?
A $400 ashtray. It's off the USS Greenville, a nuclear-tech submarine and a likely target for a torpedo. When you get hit with one, you've got enough problems without glass flying into the eyes of the navigator and the officer of the deck. We lead a slightly different life out there, and it costs a little more money.
Call me crazy, but I don't think you should be smoking on a submarine. It's like an enclosed space, and fire seems like bad. Fire seems bad. But even more than defense contracts, the Iraq War was about seizing the nation's natural resources, most famously oil. Under Saddam, Iraq's oil industry had been fully nationalized and closed to Western companies. But once the tanks rolled in, the Bush administration went to work selling those reserves out to their campaign donors. The 2000 presidential election saw Big Oil spend more money on the Bush campaign than any election up to that point in US history. And in March 2001, they set up the National Energy Policy Development Group, reviewed lists and maps outlining Iraq's entire oil productive capacity, according to CNN. The group met from February 2002 to April 2003 and agreed that Iraq should be open to international oil companies as quickly as possible after the war. Paul Bremer, the American diplomat placed in charge of Iraq following the invasion, and pioneer of the suits with boots look, immediately sold off the country's oil fields, overseeing economic reforms that The Economist called a capitalist dream in 2003. They allowed for 100% foreign ownership of Iraqi assets, cut taxes to 15%, and dropped tariffs down to 5%. While the Bush administration was hesitant to publicly say how much oil they were selling off to their friends at Exxon and Chevron, by 2007, most politicians were saying the quiet part out loud. Then Senator Chuck Hagel said this: "People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are." General John Ibazaid said, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that." And former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan wrote in his memoir, "I am saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil." I mean, I'm saddened that the wars are happening, but yeah, I'm sad that we can't be honest about how evil they are. Around this same time, the West Wing made a point to have their Democratic candidate for president promise to do no wars for oil, and accurately portrayed the Republicans as flatly denying that this was the reality of Iraq at all.
If it's ridiculous to even think of going to war for oil, then join me in my pledge.
No, that would be like going to war for sugar. Do you want to take a pledge against that too?
But, like we talked about in the last video, Matt Santos literally appoints that guy as his Secretary of State because they just agree on so much.
You agree with me on foreign policy?
Even as this information became public, the show was still reluctant to really depict the occupation as the cash grab it was. Because, as journalist and author Naomi Klein noted in 2003, some say that it's too simplistic to say this war is about oil. They're right. It's about oil, water, roads, trains, phones, ports, and drugs. Bechtel, a construction corporation whose president just so happened to be called the father of the Bush Doctrine and a major supporter of the invasion, received a $680 million contract to rebuild infrastructure in Iraq, which they didn't even really do. As Klein wrote in her book, The Shock Doctrine, much of the country remained without power during this privatization process. Mohammed Tawfiq at the industry ministry told me he had made repeated requests for generators, pointing out that Iraq's 17 state-owned cement factories were perfectly positioned both to supply the reconstruction effort with building materials and to put tens of thousands of Iraqis to work. The factories received nothing. No contracts, no generators, no help. American companies preferred to import their cement, like their workforce, from abroad at up to 10 times the price. And remember, these contracts are paid for by tax dollars. Yeah, that's exciting. In 2003, a lobbyist told the Washington Post that getting the rights to distribute Procter & Gamble products would be a gold mine. One well-stocked 7-Eleven could knock out 30 Iraqi stores. A Walmart could take over the country. Hell, even the Research Triangle Institute, a North Carolina-based nonprofit, heavy emphasis on the air quotes there, received $466 million to help bring democracy to Iraq. From Naomi Klein again, the leadership of the company's Iraq operation was dominated by high-level Mormons. People like James Mayfield, who told his mission back in Houston that he thought Muslims could be persuaded to embrace the Book of Mormon as compatible with the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. Mormons getting the short end of the stick in this episode.
In that video, people felt that I was using my child's sickness for clout and for attention.
Peak television. But the West Wing never really grapples with any of this. The show was pretty quiet about the military-industrial complex at large. When CJ raged against the treatment of women in Kumar, that's because the US is selling boatloads of weapons to them.
Not for nothing, but 3 weeks ago, a woman in Kumar was executed for adultery. She didn't need a lawyer because there wasn't any trial. It was her husband's word against hers.
Yeah.
Later today, I'm going to be announcing that we're selling them tanks and guns.
Yeah, CJ is opposed to this deal, but the framing is entirely focused on their treatment of women. No attention is paid to the billions of dollars of arms being sold, and just who's getting rich off that.
What are we selling?
15 AMRAAMs, 50 M1A1 tank kits, 10 F-15s, and Patriot missiles for $1.5 billion, and they renew the lease.
In fact, Leo is pretty cozy with a defense contractor, a guy named Ken O'Neill.
Let's try to forget for a moment his success in the private sector, creating jobs and generating enormous tax revenues the president and I get to fool around with. CEO and chairman of Mueller-Wright Aeronautics, the finest man that I have ever had the great privilege to call my friend.
Leo is shocked, and I mean absolutely flabbergasted, when he finds out that his good friend Ken has been playing a little dirty to get some of those contracts.
I gave a procurement officer at the DOD a job, and I got to a guy on the Defense Policy Board. We had to have the contract. I'm under a lot of pressure from my board.
So this was about money?
I just love how shocked Leo is here. It's fucking hilarious. There's nothing better than when Leo gets shocked about something pretty minor in the grand scheme of like actuality. Leo, wait until you find out about Halliburton. That's gonna really knock your socks off. You could see this as an aspirational portrayal of government, dreaming of a world in which our political leaders would be so personally offended by a hint of corruption.
Corruptio optimi pessima. Corruption of the best is the worst.
But given the timing, this isn't really speaking truth to power. I think if anything, this really limits the scope of perceived corruption in the defense industry. So to recap, the West Wing helped launder tons of rationales for the War on Terror, namely that Muslims are scary and violent, that we have to save them from themselves, especially the women, tacitly endorsed torture, and promoted imperialism without engaging with any substantive understanding of history in the region or the very real ways that the war was actually being prosecuted. And I think that when you look at it that way, a lot of the actions of the Obama and Biden administrations start to make a lot more sense.
This war distracts us from every threat that we face and so many opportunities we could seize. By any measure, our single-minded and open-ended focus on Iraq is not a sound strategy for keeping America safe.
While Barack Obama won the presidency in 2008 largely because he had voted against the Iraq resolution and used that to paint himself as the non-war on terror candidate, he did little to scale back American military presence in the Middle East, or the war crimes we were committing. Despite his many promises to close Torture Island, Guantanamo Bay, the black site remains open to this day, holding detainees without charges. Some of them have been there for over 20 years. Speaking of torture, the Obama Justice Department prosecuted exactly 0 people for their role in the US torture program, despite the fact that under the Convention Against Torture, which the US ratified in 1994, the US is required to both investigate and punish incidents of torture. Rather than hold people accountable for a system of torture, liberal presidents have, in fact, continued to defend it in court. Joe Biden's Solicitor General successfully blocked the testimony of CIA torturers in 2022 from going public in the case of Abu Zubaydah, a man who has been held by the US without charges since 2003, and whose torture at CIA black sites in both Thailand and Poland is international news and is not in dispute. Obama signed reauthorizations of the Patriot Act in 2010, 2011, and 2015. In fact, Obama's Countering Violent Extremism Task Force focused almost exclusively on Muslim and Arab American populations, with little attention paid to right-wing and white nationalist terrorist violence. While Obama did withdraw troops from Iraq in 2011, and Biden withdrew troops from Afghanistan in 2021, both have expanded the war on terror in other ways. Obama pioneered the horrific art of drone warfare, including in countries where Congress has not authorized military force, like in Yemen and Somalia. According to Human Rights Watch, the Obama administration seemed to have frequently defined an imminent lethal threat so broadly as to effectively revert to the more lax standards of war. According to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, a UK-based organization, the US killed 582 civilians on average annually from 2007 to 2016. Obama's Attorney General admitted in 2013 that the US had killed at least 4 Americans in drone strikes, and that 3 of them were by accident, including a 16-year-old, and that's just what they admitted to. Of course, the Trump administration took that playbook and escalated it to a bone-chilling scale. As of January 2019, US drone strikes fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria killed at least 1,257 civilians, according to the Pentagon, and monitoring group Air Wars estimates the number to be as great as 7,500. This is to say nothing of the new theaters of the war on terror that Obama opened in Libya and Yemen. In Yemen, the Obama administration helped plan, execute, and fund a brutal bombing campaign that has led to a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. Oxfam estimates that nearly half of all children under the age of 5 are currently suffering from acute malnutrition, as the Saudi-led coalition has deliberately destroyed agricultural targets, with the US's backing, of course. In Libya, the US led NATO in a bombing campaign aimed at overthrowing Gaddafi. They dropped over 20,000 bombs and killed God knows how many civilians. While the intervention had been framed as freeing the Libyan people from a tyrant, it quickly became clear that this was just like Iraq, with the New York Times publishing an article titled "The Scramble for Access to Libya's Oil Wealth Begins" on the literal day that the capital fell. The response to the war on terror from liberal leaders like Obama and Biden has been one of gleeful support and expansion, often using the same justifications that were made popular on the West Wing all those years ago. Samantha Power, a chief advisor in the Obama State Department and an architect of the US involvement in Yemen, was a huge champion of the same kind of humanitarian intervention the West Wing argued for in the Bartlett Doctrine.
My feeling is that an intervention in Iraq, even a unilateral one, is undoubtedly going to make Iraq a more humane place. I actually think it's going to be a relatively clean intervention. I'm in the minority in the human rights community probably in feeling that way, but having seen the Iraqi or the Kosovo and the Bosnia and the Afghan interventions, I have some sense of that.
The targeting of Muslim Americans through mass surveillance, which is currently now being used to deport people to concentration camps, was justified on the West Wing through its racism and Islamophobia. And it's hard to miss the similarities between the way the West Wing talked about Palestinians,
Israelis don't talk about driving the Palestinians into the sea,
and the way Democrats have responded to Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza, rejecting the International Criminal Court in much the same way as the series did. I think that we can only conclude that large swaths of liberals and Democrats agreed with some fundamental things about the war on terror, driven by racism, a desire for retribution, and free market imperialism. While the West Wing never made direct arguments to exploit foreign countries for oil or other resources, they did frequently make the case about the importance of using free trade to spread our democratic goodness across the globe.
Trade with China is essential for human rights. By engaging China and making them live by the same global trading rules as everyone else, we gain 1.2 billion consumers for our products, and we strengthen the forces of freedom.
Free trade stops wars. And that's it. Free trade stops wars.
In the words of Naomi Klein one last time, negotiations with sovereign nations can be hard. Far easier to just tear up the country, occupy it, then rebuild it the way you want. Bush hasn't abandoned free trade as some have claimed. He just has a new doctrine: bomb before you buy. Make no mistake, this is a real electoral problem for Democrats. It's not hard to see how, for some people, this election felt like choosing between someone stomping on your face with a boot or with cleats. One's worse, but we're really just talking about degrees. I'm not trying to steer people away from the Democrats or create infighting on the left. This is a time for us to band together to fight fascism. But to do so also requires us to understand many of the talking points used to turn support for good things, like stopping mass killings and freeing women, into support for imperialism and capital. Because that's what this is really all about. Money. It's honestly crazy to me how much everything just boils down to money. I'm starting to think, we should get rid of it. I mean, who needs it? Abolish it. Defund the dollar. That's my pitch for Abolish Everything, a series where creators make the case of why some aspect of society should be abolished forever before a panel hell-bent on maintaining the status quo.
Have you ever taken a lot of Adderall for your body?
The only way to stop a bad guy with a speakerphone is a good guy with a speakerphone.
From hot doctors to slow walkers, from confidence to the English language, I love how this show makes me laugh while rethinking some core aspect of our everyday lives. And it's available exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service collectively owned by us creators, producing not just longer uncut content you won't find on YouTube, but also original films and essays from some of the best creators in the game. That includes FD Signifier's interviews with white and white-passing people about the nature of being white.
People ask me, are you white? I say, it depends on the month, I guess.
Are you white?
Yeah, I would say so. You don't think so? When you look at me on YouTube, you don't think I'm a white guy?
Join famously wealthy YouTuber FD Signifier.
I just had so much hope for the white race because of you. So to know that you're like cosplaying as a white guy, white fishing, it did hurt.
And Broey Deschanel's exploration of taboo scenes in film like cannibalism and obscenity. There are even game shows like Jet Lag where creators play hide and seek across Japan. If you're looking for a less evil version of Mr. Beast content. Nebula is quickly becoming the answer to the question, how do you make art and content that is as high quality and interesting as traditional media without the corruption and exploitation associated with that industry? Another really cool thing about Nebula is that if you sign up for it using my link, a portion of your monthly subscription goes directly to me, which is a great way to help this channel while getting access to way more content. I seriously think it's pretty easy to lose yourself browsing through what is essentially Netflix for video essays, but with higher standards than Netflix, honestly. And with my link below, it comes out to just $3 a month, which in this economy is just so cheap. Name another thing you can get for $3. I'll wait. So to recap, Nebula gets you access to longer uncut videos, access to exclusive content, and a portion of your low price of $3 a month goes to me, your favorite creator. I mean, clearly, this is a really long video and you're still here. Why don't you click that link and join the Nebula train today? If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. Please share, please like, please subscribe. The next video will be all about that money that I was talking about, the neoliberalism and abundance of the West Wing and the Democratic Party, and just it all, you know. Consider supporting the channel on Patreon, patreon.com/skipintro. There you can get ad-free versions of these videos, which is nice because they're really long. You can get access to mailbags that we do. People ask me questions and I answer them. There are little skippies. There's like mini videos that I do about maybe a TV show. I did one about Severance Season 2. I did one about the anime Netflix series Devil May Cry. I also do monthly roundups where I name and talk about all the different shows that I watched this month, and we're also doing live stream watch-alongs of both West Wing content and other cop stuff. And I'm also going to be doing debriefs where I kind of talk about videos after I finish them. I go through all the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor, and also, you know, kind of reflect on what I think about how it turned out, if that's interesting to you. I mean, I do it whether it's interesting to you or not, but you know, you can also become one of these scrolling people on the page. Just the hottest people in the world, you know? So think about that. Anyways, bye!